Hi, I'm going to talk about Islam, specifically the interpretation of the Qur'an and how that impacts on people's understanding of Islam overall. I was having a chat to a Hope for Peace through the Facebook chatty thingamajig and had a talk about this, and we're talking about, for example, from the point of view of the interpretation of the Qur'an and how that relates to the Hadiths, and whether or not Hadiths are necessarily required to understand the Qur'an. And we got chatting and, we end up agreeing that I should do a video on this. So here we are, video being done. Well, when you look at the Qur'an, the major issue that the Qur'an has is that there is a lack of historical context. It's not like the Bible, which has a complete narrative. What you tend to find was that, for example, when you talk about Surah 9:29, it's not like a start to finish story. Muhammad in the year 14 whatnot, woke up and, he brushed his teeth, had a shower, and then he was slapped in the face by a polytheist. And, it doesn't go on like a narrative like that. What you see is a series of ayahs, and what you actually need is the historical context to understand those ayahs, which is all very nice, because every ayah, every revelation, every sign, depending on how you want to translate ayah, is viewed within a specific context. It was a response to a specific event that was happening inside the world, which is the reason why I have a problem with the whole argument, for example, when people say that it's uncreated, the created versus uncreated argument. I have a problem with that because it implies predestination. Basically, you're screwed. I know that's probably not a very nuanced way of putting it, but that's pretty much the long story, the short version of it. So from that point of view, you can see that when an ayah is revealed within a specific context, in other words, it's created out of a set of circumstances. It just doesn't appear out of nowhere. It appears because a series of events have occurred and God intervenes and says, "Well, okay, Muhammad, this is what I want you to do. This is the response that I want you to do with that." In other words, during the early days where the Muslims were persecuted, God said, "Hey, don't strike back, don't strike back." But eventually, God said, "Well, actually, if you believe the whole narrative, you're a Muslim, that yes, you can strike back, but there are limitations to, fighting. In other words, you can't just go out there and unleash a bloodbath. There are limitations upon it." So in other words, everything has a context inside the Quran. And this is where you have when it comes to, for example, the issue of abrogation. I have a problem with abrogation from the point of view that it tries to treat as if everything inside the Quran is devoid of context. In other words, let's just say I said to a child at 9 years old, "Don't cross the road without your parent being here." Now let's just say in 7 years the child's now 16. Is that instruction still held constant today? That was told to that child in a very specific set of circumstances. You're 9 years old, your faculties aren't fully developed, and thus you're probably better off, being with your parent and your parent taking you across the road. But does that advice still hold constant to today, when the person's 16 years old? Of course not. Because what was said when he was 9 years old was said in a specific context. The person was 9 years old. This is the set of circumstances. This was the conditions that existed. They were the material conditions that existed. In other words, the advice given to the child was based on a specific set of circumstances. And that's the same thing with the Quran. A particular revelation was provided to Muhammad based on a very specific very specific set of circumstances. In other words, it wasn't just devoid of it wasn't simply just came down from heaven out of nowhere. It was actually born out of the conditions, the material conditions on the ground. So thus, each ayah needs to be viewed within a specific context, which is the problem I have when there's the issue of abrogation. These two forms of abrogation, these intra-Quran abrogation, where one ayah apparently abrogates another ayah, and then there's abrogation from outside the Qur'an, which the majority of Muslims don't agree with. But you have within the Qur'an, you have certain these claims that certain ayahs abrogate other ayahs. But here's the problem: that's assuming that the two ayahs are being revealed in exactly the same circumstances. In other words, that ayah there happened the exact same circumstance as that ayah over here. This idea that, for example, 2256 is abrogated by 929. Now, these are two different circumstances, and they need to be viewed in two very different circumstances. They need to be viewed inside the historical narrative of the early Muslim community. You can't just simply say, well, okay, on the surface, this appears to be contradicting with that, so therefore let's just say, oh, that one overrides that one there. It completely it's an attempt to strip the context of a particular revelation, the historical context of a particular revelation from it, and somehow treat it as if it just sits there on its lonesome self, as if there was no context. You know, it's a bit like saying, for example, it'd be a bit like saying, on one side you say, okay, here's a 9-year-old, I told him not to cross the road without parents. And then what you end up saying was, well, I told this boy not to cross the road unless they have parents. See, you've now dropped a very important piece of information that gives that particular thing being said some context. The fact that it's being said to a 9-year-old, that gives a specific set of circumstances. In other words, that particular advice is given to a 9-year-old, not just any random boy, but given specifically to a 9-year-old boy. In other words, someone who's not mature enough to be able to cross the road without getting hit by a car. Because, of course, you know what kids are like. They don't check. They don't. They're not a person. They're not. You know what kids are like. They go to the road. They quickly look around. They jump out in the front of the car. They get hit. Whereas your parents, you're getting older. You're taller. Your senses are a lot more aware. You can hear things. You tend to look around a lot more. So you have a specific set of circumstances. So that's the major problem. Now the question is, how do you reconcile it? And this is the other problem that comes with it when we talk about, for example, the likes of alcohol. Muhammad, it's known. I've got a bibliography here, The Life of Muhammad, that states that Muhammad himself drank alcohol. He drank alcohol in moderation. In other words, he drank, he enjoyed himself, but he knew, hang on, I've got to pray. I can't just simply get myself intoxicated to the point that I can't actually do my obligations as being a Muslim. I've got to pray 5 times a day, so obviously I've got to drink in moderation and so forth. But what ended up happening is that basically he was surrounded by a bunch of mouth-breathing, knuckle-dragging fuckwits. To put it bluntly, the Bedouins. And no matter what he did, no matter how many times he tried to convince his fellow Bedouins that, hey, you need to calm down, there's nothing wrong with alcohol, you need to drink it in moderation, it just didn't sink in. And then eventually you tend to find, orthodox Muslim view of it is that it was banned. Now the question you have to ask is, you've got 3 particular set of circumstances. Does that last circumstance hold constant forever? In other words, if you, for example, transmitted Islam into a society whereby there isn't the rampant abuse of alcohol, in other words, alcohol is drunk, but is drunk in moderation, you don't have the kind of excess, in other words, that would have existed during the time of Muhammad, does that last ayah necessarily apply to that society? That last ayah in Muhammad's society applied because of the kind of environment that existed. A society that knew no limits. In other words, there was no moderation in drinking alcohol. People just got themselves drunk to a stupor. Couldn't function. Couldn't even look after their family. They couldn't pray. They couldn't attend the mosque. They couldn't do anything. They were just hopeless. But in a society where they have those limits, where you have the moderation, does that last ayah necessarily apply to their particular society? We also need to look, for example, inside the first 4 caliphs. You find that, for example, in the first 4 caliphs, neither of them enforce Sharia comprehensively. Now, some people argue, well, there was issues of wars and so forth, but even then, most of them weren't particularly interested in it. There were things like such as, murder and rape and so forth, which were, which are considered things that are violations of an individual's right to be able to, live their life unmolested. But at the same time, when it came to things like drinking alcohol, that was seen as something that was just left up to the individual. There was no attempt by the state apparatus to ever come into the individual life and say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. Which is the reason why you find, for example, the likes of the Khazarites who end up trying to claim that all and sundry weren't holy enough and they had abandoned the true faith of Islam. It's, like I've said, when you look at it from that point of view, I wonder to what extent have the interpretations within inside Islam have imposed some sort of rigidity. It's almost as though, like any religion, it starts off as a fringe movement, and then when it gradually becomes mainstream, it becomes more rigid to the point that it's become the very thing that it originally rebelled against. You look at Christianity, it rebelled against, it eventually split off from Judaism and rebelled against Judaism. You look at Judaism. Originally, it was the lower socio-economic, the serfs, the slaves, and so forth of the society of that particular area that split off and turned into Judaism, and then eventually the rigidity and conservatism almost embedded itself, and then you have another movement that spawns out, then another movement that spawns out of it. There's not, this is the one thing that I find quite funny, that, it seems that a lot of religions start off with a hiss and a roar, and very much a progressive outlook, moving forward approach, and at some point it's like going, well, okay, we've moved as far as we want to move, let's stop the bus, and this is as far as we go. That's why what I find interesting from it. I mean, there was an interesting point that was made on that documentary called Taqwa Core, and he was talking about the fact that Islam started off with a hiss and a roar. It was dynamic, it was strong, it was progressive, it was assertive, it was in your face. It wasn't just simply it was overturning the status quo. The status quo of the Bedouin Arabs. It was overthrowing tribalism. It was overthrowing, the boasting of lineage. I happen to be the third relation to Ibn Wanka. These kinds of things. It started off as something that was very much something that challenged the status quo, but then eventually it became the status quo. And this is the reason why I've always questioned when we talk about the Sunni definition of who is a companion was anybody who saw Muhammad before Muhammad died. I'm sorry, any Tom, Dick and Harry seeing Muhammad before he died suddenly becomes a companion is just ridiculous. This has been about the lowest bar you could have. Any person could see Muhammad before he died. I mean, it's getting to the point of being ridiculous. I mean, and the Shia have a slightly, of course, higher bar. But I would argue that anybody who joined the Muslim community after in other words, if they didn't join before the Hijrah, then they should be simply discarded. I mean, you want to get back to a point that, hang on, who are your really hardcore devoted people versus the people who just simply jump on the bandwagon at the last minute because they happen to be the winning side? If you are going to use people, the early community, as a reference point, then you sure as heck have to make damn sure that you're actually going to weed out the people who are actually genuine in their confession of faith and those who simply just jumped on the bandwagon. The same very people who basically end up turning Islam into the status quo, turning into the establishment, and turning into the same sort of repressive mechanism that existed prior to Islam. So, from that point of view, like I said, when it comes to the Qur'an and how it's interpreted, when we look at the Hadiths, we have to ask ourselves, is that necessarily the correct way of understanding it? I mean, do the Hadiths necessarily point to, for example, to the Qur'an having to be interpreted in that particular way, or this idea that somehow we have a hadith and it has to be retrofitted into the Qur'an in terms of the